Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Naman Haftom. I'm the Senior Vice President here at the Cambridge Middle East North Africa Forum. We're delighted to invite all of you for joining us. I want to thank you all for joining us today at our China's Middle East Policy event. We have a wonderful panel, and basically the format will consist of brief opening remarks, and then moving on to the moderator asking questions, and then the audience as well. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all the speakers, and then I'm just going to head right over to Dawn with no further delay. So joining us today is Alessandro Arduino, who's a principal research fellow of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And his latest book is China's Private Army, Protecting the New Silk Road. Also joining us is Degang Sun, who's a professor of political sciences at the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University in Shanghai, China. His research interests are Middle Eastern politics and international relations, great power strategies in the Middle East, as well as China and the Middle East. After him is Jonathan Fulton, who's an assistant professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. His research focuses on China and Middle East relations. Joining us from Durham University is Anush Heteshami, who's a professor of international relations, and he's currently the Nasser al-Sabah Chair and the Director of the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies there. And our moderator for tonight's event is Dawn Murphy, who's the Assistant Professor of International Security Studies at the U.S. Air War College, where she specializes in Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics, as well as U.S.-China relations and international relations, and specifically, she also examines China's relations with the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, with that being said, permit me to hand it over to Dawn. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for having us today. We have an amazing group of scholars today to talk about China's Middle East policy, what's next. We're going to go in the order of the program, and each speaker will have approximately 10 minutes to make prepared remarks. Dr. Arundel is speaking on the Digital Belt and Road, and he's actually dialing in from Singapore. This is an amazing event today. We have him dialing in from Singapore. We've got Sun Degang at 1 a.m. dialing in from Shanghai. Jonathan Fulton, who is with us from the UAE, and Dr. Heteshami from the UK. And so Degang is going to speak about China's high-tech diplomacy, Jonathan, COVID diplomacy, and Anush on the Belt and Road economic agenda. So we have a broad range of topics. So I'm going to hand that over to you. Once they are done, I will ask a few questions of the panel, and then we should have about 30 minutes for Q&A from the participants. And the protocol for that will be raising your hand with the raise hand function, and then each of you will be able to ask your questions when we open it up. So I'm going to hand it on over to Alex. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dawn. Good afternoon, good evening, and especially good morning to our audience. And I said especially for the one who are in this side of the world where it's 1 a.m. My take on what's next, China policy in the Middle East, my angle is on security. So basically, I will use this 10 minutes in looking at how China is managing its anxiety over the Middle East uncertainty. Middle East security architecture is in transformation and in transition. Since Obama administration, the United States started a process of disengagement that has been accelerated during Trump administration. We have to see the direction during Biden. One thing is sure is that the US is not leaving the Middle East. It will start probably to be what it was like just not long ago, a security provider, but an offshore guarantor, and still the US military backbone is going to be essential for the Middle East. Having said that, the growth of China anxiety in the region is related to the threat to the development of the Belt and Road Initiative. So basically we are looking at failing border, transnational fluid criminality, growing terrorist networks. Basically now we are 10 years since the Arab Spring, and I just want to use the example of Libya. Libya, 2011, the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi regime, China had to evacuate overnight more than 36,000 of its nationals. And at the time, that event was an eye-opener for Beijing, a lesson how the principle of non-interference could not stop the bullet from local militia. At the time, there was a call for China to be more proactive in the security arena, especially in the Middle East. And several times I saw this label attached to China intervention in the Middle East, like unwilling security partner or unwilling security provider. I don't like much the use of label, but in my opinion, the Chinese policy now, and it was next is not only related if China is going to have, let's say, a more active stance in the Middle East security arena, but what I like to call it, it's a policy based on balanced vagueness. What I mean by balanced vagueness is basically, if we still look at the Libyan example, it means placing bet on both sides. In Tripolitania, with the GNA, Government of National Accord, still there is a chance for the GNA to jump on the BRI. At the same time, PetroChina is working very hard to get his position in Benghazi, in Cyrenaica, on the other side, the side of the Libyan National Army, led by Major General Khalifa Haftar. And why this is quite important and also can be translated in the security arena to other areas, such as Syria and so on. Very simple, because in Libya, you can see that there is an increasing presence of Russia, Turkey, UAE, even France, that provide military hardware that can be decisive for winning a battle. But not many countries have the willingness, the financial capacity, and the technical capability, like China, to provide the effort to rebuild a country. In this respect, there are still some, in my opinion, in personal opinion, some over-expectation from several Middle East countries that China is just going to arrive and flood in the country with financial aid. But still, if we go back to the security arena, what are the key points that can create anxiety for China? First and foremost is energy security. In the Middle East, 50% of crude oil is related to China energy interest. And before the Belt and Road Initiative, China state-owned enterprises already created a set of security procedure, mostly based on private security company, to protect their asset. If we look at Chinese oil field in Iraq, for example, they are in the southern part of the country, but then again, they need protection against terrorism, against criminal actor, against kidnapping and ransom, against vandalism even. Then the second part is protecting Chinese company along the Belt and Road Initiative. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative around the world, from Central Asia to CPEC to Africa, every time that there is an MOU, there is a lot of media resonance. While it's quite strange, BRI inroad in the Middle East is a kind of flying below the radar. It's still there, it's expanding, but then Beijing have to provide protection, especially guarding its own workers against kidnapping, ransom, or act of violence. PLA is not going to jump in too soon. We saw the call from President Xi Jinping just a few weeks ago to having a more modern, professional expeditionary force that is able to win wars, but it will take time. And then we will still have to see if there is the willingness to utilize a capable expeditionary force. And then we have a gap, a security gap. For the moment being, part of this security gap is addressed by the Chinese private security company. Now, I think we can take more than the day just talking what is a private security company in China and what is the private part of it. because still there are some ambiguity where the state and the private sector part, but I think it's not today the time to discuss about it. Let's have to say that is a growing sector, the private security sector in China. There are several thousand, 8,000 companies in China with more than 3 million security officers. But if we look at the professional company outside the country, and especially the one that operate in the Middle East, securing, guarding the Chinese infrastructure, or patrolling the coast of Somalia and the Gulf of Aden in anti-piracy effort, then we can see there are no more than 20 companies. But companies that are capable in risk management, in training, risk assessment, even using drone and cyber capabilities. The third pillar of this security component is counterterrorism. And the fourth, that in my personal opinion is not very studied recently, is cybersecurity. We don't have to forget that along with the Belt and Road Initiative, since 2017, there is an increasing presence of the digital Silk Road. And digital Silk Road now is just related on the media mostly to the obsession of 5G and the role of Huawei, but it's also the security role of companies who provide fiber optical cable, infrastructure, and China is building its own standard and its own digital ecosystem in all the MENA region. If we look up to now in pure term of security, then we can see that still the economic security nexus is the important part for Beijing. And we just look at the numbers in arm transfer, a Chinese number pale in comparison to the one of the United States. CIPRI database, if I recall correct, mentioned that from 2014 to 2018, China had 5% of the market, while the US had more than 50%. Then please let me recap. The 4 points in the security arena are energy security, protection of the Belt and Road investment. And that's quite interesting because while Beijing is still quite risk averse and in a stance that it's still reactive, China private company, medium company, and even some SOEs, they have a very high level of risk appetite. They invest in area quite dangerous. They invest in area where even the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is asking to don't go in that area. And probably is related to the fact that this high risk appetite is the fact that there is still a diffuse sense that if there is any problem, they can just call the embassy on the consulate and they will take care of it. Or probably they saw too many times the movie Wolf Warrior. And with this, Dawn, I just give the floor back to you and I wait after for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna hand it over to Degang, and he's gonna share some PowerPoint slides for his presentation.
Yes, I would like to share a slide. I think I have been forbidden by the host of this room to share the slide.
Just a second, it looks like Naman's working.
I think just 1 second. I think I'm forbidden to share the slide.
Naman, we can't hear you.
Aman, can you?
Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Can I share the slide?
Can you begin and I'll see if I can sort it out on my end. In worst case, we'll have to try without it.
Yes.
That's okay. Sorry about
that. In that case, I failed again. Therefore, may I just present without slides?
Yes, and Naman, if he'll try to bring it up while you're presenting, but yes, if you could start, that would be great.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to talk about China's high-tech diplomacy towards the Arab countries in the new era. According to Chinese government, in the past 400 years, there have been 4 industrial revolutions. The first one is mechanization, revolution starting in 1760, and UK was the leader. And the second revolution is started in 1870s, that is electrification. US and Germany were the leaders. And the third one started in 1950s to 1960s, and US was the leader. So if you look at the past three revolutions, China was the bystander. But in the early 21st century, we have the fourth industrial revolution of intellectualization. It is actually interconnection of physical, virtual, biological worlds. Therefore, we can find multiple competitors. Apart from US, China, Japan, European powers, South Korea, Russia, India, and Israel are also the competitors. It's increasing very rapidly in an exponential development. 5G stations, UHV, new energy, big data center, artificial intelligence, etc., are the major phenomena. So in December 2018, the Central Economic Work Conference of China put forward the concept of new infrastructure, that is 5G, AI, industrial, internet, and Internet of Things are the core of new infrastructure. So for the fourth industrial revolution, it has three features. One is the integration of multiple industries. The second one is it has multi players, not only developing countries, but also developed countries, and the small-sized countries are the competitors. And for the fourth industrial revolution, state is the major driving force instead of companies. So China, and also Arab countries, had glorious history in the medieval ages. Chinese and Arabs were the predominant pioneers in high technology of the world. So now they would like to take the fourth industrial revolution and to become the core countries in high-tech advancement. According to 2019 Index of Innovation of Middle Eastern countries, Israel ranks number 10, Turkey ranks number 49, but for the most Arab countries, they are very low. UAE ranked only 36. So China would like to take this advantage because China ranked number 14 is quite high. It would like to have interdependent relations in high-tech development and innovation with Arab countries. Therefore, in the past, we say China Arab countries have 1+2+3 framework. One is energy cooperation. Two means commercial and trade relations. Number three is a kind of new energy. But in the future, I'm afraid it will be a framework of 1+2+3 and +4. 4 means high-tech cooperation between China and the Arab countries. So apart from energy, economic, and political partnerships between China and Arab countries, in the future, there could be a high-tech partnership.
Dr. Sun, one hand, I'm sorry, I think you can now share the...
Now, can I? Okay, let me try it. I think it will be much easier for us to see the slides. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Let me start. Yes, this is the 4 industrial revolutions and China's roles. And this is the ranking of 2019 innovation of index in the world. We see China would like to take advantage of the of Arab countries for 1+2+3+4 partnerships. Number 4 is actually the partnership in high-tech area. This is a new frontier area. China and Arab countries are not ready, but phase 4 will be the new stage of the so-called new infrastructure. First of all, China has technological advantages while Arab countries have a potential market. That will be interdependence. The second one is China and Arab countries can form a circulation of technological cooperation without the developed countries. China designated as a kind of South-South cooperation. And the third one is China's Technological Transfer Center would like to give the technology to the Arab countries as the leverage for the targeted countries to support China on sovereign interests, including their staunch support on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Taiwan issues, and South China Sea issues. The fourth one is China and Arab countries are promoting the docking of their technological cooperation. Therefore, they can have a new model of decentralized high-tech cooperation, which is different from the old one of core periphery model dominated by the Western countries. So this is a multi-players in China Arab Technology Transfer Center. It's in Chinese. We can see that 73 Chinese service sectors are involved. 34 high universities are involved, and 305 high-tech companies of China and involved. They have built 10 high-tech industrial parks. I think they have high-tech transfer centers, institutions of 39. So these are very important ones. This table shows the key areas in China-Arab high-tech cooperation, including nuclear energy. And you see Saudi Arabia, UAE, Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Sudan are involved. And the solar energy, UAE, Egypt, and Morocco are involved. And for satellites, Saudi Arabia, Algeria are the major partners. For Beidou navigation systems, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Algeria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Sudan have signed MOUs with China. For lunar probe, Saudi Arabia is the predominant partner vis-a-vis UAE, right? And for technology transfer and drones and 5Gs, you can see the countries. For limited time, I will not read it. We see that Huawei has established the research centers in various countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE for the research centers. For vaccine for COVID-19, you can see more countries. I think Jonathan will discuss it later on. So the prospect of China-Arab high-tech cooperation is very promising, especially in biomedicine and marine researches. And this one will have a very profound impact on the Western predominance of the so-called technology moron doctrine, because Western countries would like to have a monopoly in technological cooperation with the allies in the Arab countries. But in the future, China can break this kind of orbit relations. But China tries to avoid politicization in the technology cooperation. Finally, China is still lagging behind US in technology. Therefore, the Arab countries is suffering a lot from brain drain, and China's high-tech diplomacy towards the Arab countries can be step by step in pivot countries and in key domains. In the foreseeable future, China will not be the predominant player in high-tech. Therefore, can I conclude by saying that high technology is for human prosperity and progress, and science has no boundaries. It should be market-driven, apolitical, and win-win. There's a great potential for the third-party cooperation in high-tech area between China, the West, and the Arab world. But unfortunately, in reality, we can see the great power rivalries in the Middle East is encroaching into the high-tech area. So in the future, high-tech cooperation between China and Arab countries will be blocked and sometimes affected by the Western powers. Thank you so much for your attention. Your feedback is highly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'll hand over the floor to Jonathan now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Degang. Very strange that as soon as you stopped talking, whoever that was turned off their obnoxious noise. But it's really great to be here tonight. Thanks for the invitation. It's really great to see so many familiar faces under the, folks observing us, and of course the panel. You've brought together some great people. So the topic I was asked to speak about is COVID diplomacy. And I'll talk mostly about the politics of it, not so much the COVID. I think at this point, we're all pretty tired of hearing about the COVID. One thing that I think has been pretty interesting watching from my vantage point is Don mentioned, I'm in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. What we've seen during the pandemic is in much of the world, China, especially early on, faced some reputational costs, especially on the way COVID was handled in early days. This also was met with a new kind of assertive diplomacy out of China that Alessandro mentioned, with the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where a new generation of diplomats and spokespeople were much more muscular in how they presented China's image around the world. And as they were taking a lot of body blows in how people were criticizing them, they're pretty content to dish it back. So there's a really contentious diplomatic atmosphere, which is kind of unusual. But at the same time, we saw in a lot of Asian countries, China's relations were suffering most dramatically with India, when we saw last summer in the Gawan Valley, this clash between Chinese and Indian forces. In Europe, we saw a lot of problems with China's reputation. Of course, in the US and Canada and North America, we saw it quite dramatically. I don't have data on this. I'd love to see it, but I think what we see often is a lot of regime types. It seems to be kind of lining up along a lot of democratic countries. Saw the way China handled this in a pretty negative light. Interestingly, in a lot of non-democratic countries, this wasn't necessarily the case. And especially in the Middle East, where we didn't really see a lot of countries speaking out about China. In fact, it really went the other way, where you could see a lot of praise for how China handled things. There can be a lot of reasons for this. I mean, like, again, if you look at, in the US, the Pew Research Center, for example, has the Global Attitude and Trends Survey, and they collected data and showed that American attitudes, unfavorable opinions of China, more than doubled between 2019 and 2020. Well, we don't really have access to that kind of data in much of the Middle East. It's pretty hard to get reliable survey data, and a lot of the press is state-owned, so you don't really get to see the same kind of coverage. What I found that was interesting, my students are almost all Emirati. I'll talk to Emirati officials or friends, and privately they might be a little more critical, but then you would see in the press, for example, that it would have lots of praise, saying that China presents a model for how the rest of the world could approach this pandemic. So it's quite interesting to see this variation, between, on the one side, some certain countries looking at China quite negatively, and here in the Middle East, China making actually quite a lot of gains. And there were reasons. Obviously, China did provide a lot of PPE. They provided a lot of support, material aid, and they've been cooperating with a lot of Middle Eastern countries on tracking and tracing, and of course also on vaccine development and testing. But I think there's more politically going on, which I think is a little more interesting. So maybe I'll go off the track of just talking about the COVID itself, and just, what else might be leading this more positive view of China across the region. I think there's 4 big points that I can kind of look at without thinking too hard. And I'm sure as we get comments from the viewers, I might get some more ideas. But I think the first big takeaway is obviously the absence of US leadership during this pandemic has been a tremendous opportunity for China in the region. Now, typically, Middle Eastern countries are going to look towards the West, they'll look towards the UK or the US for leadership in something like this. And of course, those 2 countries have a lot of historical ties to Middle Eastern countries, a lot of political, diplomatic, security. Across the board, these 2 countries have always been very, very important. And of course, they were 2 case studies, sorry to slag my hosts, but the UK obviously was not a very good example of a successful approach to COVID, and the US was a disaster. When the US couldn't support itself, how could they offer any kind of support to their allies and partners in the Middle East? So countries that normally would be inclined to look towards Washington for help on something like this found that the US was so completely caught up in the politicizing of this global health crisis, in fighting over things like masks and social distancing. It didn't really have anything to offer in the way of leadership on this. And China, we've all been watching. I mean, people going to nightclubs in Wuhan without masks because China seems to have handled this in a pretty effective way. So I think the first one is just that China has offered a model of leadership on this crisis that other Western countries haven't. I think another big takeaway is that there's an economic imperative. Everybody knows, obviously, that the economy has been has been terribly affected by this. In a lot of Middle Eastern countries, especially resource exporting countries, have been especially badly hit. Even before COVID, you know, just here in the UAE, Dubai was desperate to hold the expo because they needed cash. You know, that their economy had been in trouble for a while, and then when you throw in all the businesses closing, tourism shutting down, oil prices falling through the basement floor, you know, obviously the economic consequences are pretty dramatic. And a lot of countries in the region realize that this recovery is going to require a lot of economic engagement with China. It's the biggest source of extra regional source of foreign direct investment. It's the largest trading partner for most countries in the region. It's a major source of contracting. So, you know, I think a lot of countries are looking to a post-pandemic world and imagining that China is going to be economically quite important to them. Something that Degang just brought up, which I thought was brilliant, is the technological side. And this is something that we really have to start engaging with a lot more seriously. What we saw the past 4 years is a lot of Western countries wagging their fingers at Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries and saying, don't do 5G with Huawei, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. And then Middle Eastern countries would say, well, A, that's quite paternalistic and very patronizing. B, do you have a better alternative at a better price that you can offer the same type of things, the full kit rather than partial kit? And of course, there's always a lot of limitations on what certain Western countries are able to provide, whereas Chinese companies don't really face those types of limitations. They can come in and offer kind of the whole package. And in the Middle East, it's very attractive. What we see, especially in the Middle East, is this isn't a liberal democratic region by any stretch. And I don't mean that as a criticism, I just mean it as a fact. I've lived here for 14 years. Liberalism is not, there aren't deep roots for liberalism here. When Western countries warn Middle Eastern countries about the potential consequences of the way China uses data or privacy issues, how AI might be used, you know, in a Western liberal democratic country, that would cause a lot of problems. Here, it doesn't have the same issues. You don't see the same types of concerns. In fact, I would argue that they line up quite nicely in a lot of cases. The China model, economic growth without political reform, is tremendously attractive across the region. Most countries look at China and think, how can we do that? How can we maintain that kind of political control and still open up the economy to that degree? And if China has the ticket, then they want it. And the fourth point, you know, just to focus again on the U.S. and I should point out, I'm not from the States, so I don't want to sound like I'm being critical of our friend, but there are a lot of concerns in the region about America's commitments to the Middle East. And when you look at numbers of troops, when you look at what the numbers of diplomats, when you look at arms sales, it kind of seems silly. We're not seeing this dropping. But if you listen to any Democrat or any Republican or anybody in any government position, nobody's getting a vote by saying, let's engage more deeply in the Middle East. You know, let's do more in the Middle East. All you have to do is, you know, this week in Foreign Affairs, there was an article by Senator Chris Murphy, you know, saying we've got to think differently about the Middle East. Last January, Ambassador Martin Indyk, former ambassador in Israel, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, saying the Middle East isn't worth it anymore. Everybody in the region is watching the U.S. and thinking this is a country that maybe isn't willing to play the same kind of role here as it has over the past 40 years. So I don't think China's necessarily the answer, but I think it's an answer. And I think the Middle East is looking at as many great power partnerships as possible, whether that's China, Russia, the EU, whether that's the UK, whether it's India. There are a lot of countries that you're seeing are developing a much bigger presence here. And I think there's just a sense that all those countries I just listed have a lot to offer, but China offers, I would argue, a lot more. You know, its Belt and Road Initiative seems to be a fully formed idea of what how China sees the Middle East fitting in with its larger strategic ambitions. And you don't really see that from too many powers. Just my last point related to this is that typically when you see countries, the US, the UK, Canada, wherever, talking about the Middle East, it's always as a problem to be solved. It's always in a negative context. When you hear Chinese leaders talk about the Middle East, it's always as an opportunity. We're going to rely on these Silk Road narratives that Degang just mentioned. You know, centuries of cooperation, of cultural relations, of religious cooperation. And we're going to, we see the Middle East as the middle of this great Eurasian project. That's pretty attractive when for the past 100 years, all you've heard is Western countries talking about how they're going to get your stuff and how they're going to kill your terrorists and any number of negative things. I don't think this means China looks at the Middle East with blinders and says, oh, it's a beautiful, peaceful place. I think they have a very realistic recognition of what the problems are, but they also have a different way of presenting their public narrative, and I think that's quite attractive. So I'll stop here. Look forward to everybody's questions, and again, thanks for the invitation.
Great, thank you. And now we'll hand it over to Anush.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I should thank the Cambridge Middle East and Africa Forum for inviting me and also for getting it all together, which is a wonderful occasion. And also lament them for putting me last to follow these distinguished speakers who are going to cause a major embarrassment to me as I come last. But I've enjoyed very much their comments, and I will be relating to some of the stuff they say in my brief presentation. So the BRI, I think, we all know what it's about. So what I want to do is provide a bit of context. Very quickly, a bit of background to it. Of course, the New Silk Road was an initiative of the late 20th, early 21st century. What is of particular interest is the speed with which it has evolved to what it is today. And that tells us something about the historic transformations which are taking place. And I think the critical shift came following the subprime crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, in which China and much of East Asia were relatively less adversely affected by the subprime crisis than were the Western economies, particularly the West financial sectors, New York centers, New York and London in particular. I think that provided Chinese leadership with a perspective that the crisis would delay the West's ability to recover financially, and that was a great historic opportunity for China to push forward. And it is about then that we hear the launch of the One Belt, One Road, following very quickly from what was this New Silk Road, poorly defined, if I may say so, with resonating to history and some ad hoc projects. We remember Pakistan at the time, but it didn't have the coherence that we now assume that BRI has. And then just as books and articles were started being written about OBOR, we shift very dramatically to the Belt and Road Initiative that President Xi Jinping himself put on the table in 2013. This is a very short period of time for a country that is not known for moving fast. China's strategy is very measured, very calculated, and is very deliberate. This, to me, is a rapid transformation, and we need to explain and understand why and how it's happened. In my view, the BRI is now a major tool in China's globalization strategy, and it's increasingly an instrument for extension of China's soft power. And issues that Alex and Degang and Jonathan have brought up already feed very much into this kind of narrative that I'm proposing. To support the BRI, China has now built the financial infrastructure, and it's not just the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, it's the solid funds allocated to the BRI. It has built the bureaucratic administrative infrastructure for it. BRI features in ministries, and has also provided a cultural network. There are universities which now focus on teaching the languages of the BRI. There are cultural centers that celebrate the BRI. There is funding to be had for any Chinese institution that has BRI as one of its prominent agendas and priorities. So BRI is now filtering right across the Chinese networks, and is being supported very strongly by the party. The BRI, I think, also sits at the heart of what the Chinese Communist Party has come to regard as a period of strategic opportunity, what the party calls once in a century transformation. This is a really significant terminology to be using. And the window for it is also, from CCP's papers, is a narrow one that China needs to take advantage of and needs to do it right now. What that means, it means that China capitalizes on this transformation of the world, and increasingly to move from what was called as peaceful development to rationalized peaceful rise, not only to itself, but also to the rest of the world. What that entails for China to become Asia's indispensable power, to enable Eurasia and its vast natural resources to become part of China's growing and expanding orbit, to firmly shift the balance of power towards Eurasia with China at its pivot, and to create strong interdependencies in the ways that Degang talked about earlier. I see that the noise is back with us. The BRI today encompasses 120 countries. At its beginning, it was about 63, 64, 67 or so, and it went up literally as the clock was ticking. And it forms the world's biggest network in its history of infrastructure projects, including hundreds of ongoing projects and billions of dollars of financial commitments across it. Somewhere I read recently that there were as many as 3,000 BRI related projects going on, and maybe as much as $400 billion has been committed in cash or in kind. BRI is an open-ended agenda. It doesn't have an end. It has a beginning, and that is really important, because what that means, the BRI will arguably shape the global economic order in China's image. It will bring ultimately into China's orbit about 60% of the world's GDP. Let's pause on that for 1 second. It'll bring together 70% of the world's population going forward. And it will bring within its networks of connectivities 75% of the world's known energy resources. These are huge transformational changes taking place. But at the same time also, BRI will accelerate what we call systemic shift. That is to say, the increasingly rapid eastward movement of the weight of the world economy from what we might call the North Atlantic zone to what we can now call the Asian zone. The BRI encourages these transformations. It is, in short, the very soul of the new China dream, of renewal, of revitalization and fulfillment. But the China dream is also about China's place in the world. And the BRI, in my view, can help build, consolidate the China dream along 4 axes. What are these? First, economic. BRI will not only spread growth to China's neglected, non-hand populated Western regions, which is a significant development, but will also secure markets for China's industrial commodities, be they steel, chemicals, cables, cement, computers, and artificial intelligence. It will provide markets for China's semi-processed and semi-manufactured goods. It'll provide markets for China's services, and of course, ultimately give Chinese corporations a competitive advantage in these growing markets for trade and investment. Second axis is strategic. The BRI will create interdependencies which only China will be able to sustain and service. Connectivity is driven by China, and as such, China will be very much the hub of these developments. Thirdly, geostrategic. The BRI will transform China into an unrivaled Eurasian great power. This is immensely important for China's national strategy, but also for its national security. And last but not least, political. BRI gives China extraordinary soft power as it puts its resources, ideas, and vision of development at the service of the BRI partners. China's BRI diplomacy emphasizes such terminologies as shared growth, common interest, mutual benefit advantage, terminologies as many of these countries have not been very familiar with. And that sits in sharp contrast, echoing what Jonathan was saying, to the West's approach to the non-Western world, particularly parts of Asia. But it's not all milk and honey. There are pitfalls and fears on all sides. BRI epitomizes one-way traffic to many, and as such is seen as a rope pulling the rest of the world towards China. BRI allows China to shift its considerable weight and thus reinforce dependencies and imbalances in economic power relations rather than create genuine interdependencies. But for China itself, as many Chinese scholars have also noted this, BRI poses considerable reputational risk for this emerging global power. From environmental concerns to behavior of some of its partners, to dealing with weak legal frameworks in the host countries, corrupt practices of some of the partners that China has to deal with, to reinforcing the role of inefficient and ineffective state-run enterprises, but it is China which has to make them good, to ensuring that the financial commitments being made by China are being used properly and fully, and the funds not being abused. So for one country to oversee the unpacking of so many projects is an enormous task, and it does sap China's albeit huge energies going forward. And also, of course, China needs to make sure that the benefits of its contributions are visibly shared by the people of the partner countries. Nothing is more embarrassing for people to reject China's largesse in this context. But also, the BRI exposes China to tensions that it rather not get involved with, these being geopolitical. In Northeast Asia, in Central Asia, in South Asia, and in West Asia, namely the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, these are all geopolitical potholes that China has so far masterfully avoided. The BRI actually has to navigate virtually all of these arenas. China will have to compete with Russia in Central Asia. It'll have to keep an eye on India in South Asia. It'll have to be conscious of the United States in Western Asia and the Middle East. None of these big elephants are things that it can manage very easily. On top of all these, of course, is this emergence of so-called alliance of Asian democracies, India, South Korea, and Japan, bringing Australia into this zone as well, of a coalition of non-authoritarian actors that are responding to China's push. If successful, implementation of BRI will lead to a process of de-Westernization of the international system, arguably. We need to ask, what would China put in place of what exists today? But this is irreversible. 2020 was when China, for the first time in history, replaced the United States as Europe's main trading partner. This is earthquake dimension. And while Europe may be the end of the Eurasian belt of BRI, the Middle East is very much the heart of it, as Jonathan has noted already. China is already the principal or main trading partner of at least 10 Middle Eastern countries. Many of those countries are allies of the United States. So where China goes, the rest of the world is following. And the BRI is providing the frameworks and the platforms for integration of this Eurasian landmass around China. And this is revolutionary, not evolutionary. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Can't hear you, Don.
Yeah, we still can't hear you. It says you're unmuted, but. I'm sorry.
Can't hear you.
I'll make you host and see if that makes a difference. Can you try again? Do you want to call back in? Sure. In that case, while she's reconnecting, I'll just explain again how we're going to handle audience questions. So once the panel discussion is finished, if you go to the participants button in the bottom, and then you'll see raise hand, will be a raised hand, and then we'll be able to pick you up from there.
No, still not.
So, I don't know what to do from here. Still nothing, I'm sorry.
We're getting a weird little reverb though, Don, that might be coming from you. I don't know.
From me.
Maybe
No,
Don can quit and then re-enter the room.
I think that's what she just tried.
Yeah. Well, does anybody have any question while we try to figure out Don's?
Yeah, perhaps we should do that. So if you have any question, I'll select while try to sort out Don's technical issues.
Can I have a question for Anush?
Sure, of course.
Yes, I like your presentation, and you mentioned BRI, but actually in late last year, in 2020, the fifth session of the Communist Party of China's 19th Congress have a new report saying that in the future, especially since 2021, China would like to have dual circulations. One is internal circulation, the other is the circulation between China and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
However, there's another terminology, another sentence saying that we will regard the internal circulation as the predominant.
Right.
Do you think that BRI will be affected by the dual circulations, especially the internal circulation inside China? Thank you.
Yeah. Would you like me to answer?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Degang. Absolutely insightful question. I see them running as parallel, and I'm following closely debates in China about is it one or another, that the domestic focus is now going to consume more of the energies. I don't see that taking away the commitments which are being made to BRI. It may mean that they need to consolidate some of the projects, or not allow any company or country that would like to become a BRI partner to be a bit more rigid about the relationships. But I think that actually what happens along the BRI will benefit China's domestic development as well in any case. So I think the strategy will be to avoid an either or, but rightly, I think the focus is going to be on the inside. President Xi Jinping announced just recently that poverty has now been more or less eliminated in China. That is an extraordinary statement to make by what is still a developing country. To me, that's a signal that China is raising, if you like, its development strategy to new arenas. And for those to work, as we've heard from President Xi Jinping and others, for those to work, China will to have a broader integrated approach to its economy. That's why globalization has moved on as a mantle from the West to China. It's essential for China's economic growth and development. And BRI, I still believe, is very much part and parcel of that strategy.
Thank you so much. Excellent.
Let's see. I'm sorry, Don, we still can't hear you. So in that case, let's just go ahead with audience questions, if that's okay with all the panelists. We'll go ahead next to Jemima Barr.
Hi, thank you all for really interesting presentations. My question is about the US and China. And so, you know, it strikes me that there are certain aspects in the Middle East, like, you know, peace, stability, that are in both the US and China's strategic interests. And so this is really directed at anyone in the panel or all of you. But what prospects do you think there are for constructive collaboration, if any, between the US and China in the Middle East?
Is there anyone who wants to pick that up first? Jonathan?
Sure. I think there's a lot. I mean, so when I look at China and the US and the Middle East, first of all, it's kind of hard to divorce that from the global bilateral relationship, where there's a lot of tension and a lot of problems. But in the Middle East, the two countries' interests line up very, very neatly, actually. You know, what the US wants in the Middle East is pretty much what China wants in the Middle East as well. They just want to approach it in different ways. So I think there's actually a lot of room if they can put the politics behind them, which again is very difficult. But there's a lot of opportunity to focus on things like reconstruction, on how to deal with Iran, on how to deal with maritime security issues, develop standard setting on these technological projects that are redefining a lot of what's going on here. And in fact, I'm working on a project that would bring people together to try to talk about this, because I think what we see, a big problem we have in academia and also in government, is we tend to get siloed off. You're the China guy, or you're the Middle East person, or you're the US politics. It's very rare that people can cover all that territory. So people don't really have a very good understanding of what China's interests are in the Middle East, or what America's interests are with China. They tend to be more focused on one thing. So there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be a conflictual relationship here. Now, in Central Asia or Southeast Asia, that's a different story. But in the Middle East, I think there's actually a lot of opportunity for them to engage themselves in a pretty constructive way.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
That's a great question about Sino-US relations in the Middle East. First of all, Sino-US has very fierce competition in the Asia-Pacific regions. But however, in the Middle East is neither US nor Chinese vital interest. Second, China and US have different ideologies, but there's no ideological rivalry in the Middle East because China does not have this willingness to spread its communism. And the third one is China pursues geo-economic interest, while US pursues geopolitical interest for predominance and hegemony. Therefore, it's compatible. In terms of cooperation, I think Jonathan is right. There's a huge area of cooperation. First is conflict resolution for the Middle Eastern refugee issues in Yemen, in Syria, and in Libya, etc. China does not have troops. US has very few troops. Therefore, the two countries can have a lot of cooperation for humanitarian assistance. The second one is China and US are interdependent in the Middle East because US allies are mostly China's partners. Therefore, China is supporting US allies economically. So there's no conflict of interests except Iran. Thank you.
Anush, yes.
Just briefly picking up Degang's last point, I think it's true that there is a lot of shared interest, if not common interest, shared interest in stability, counterterrorism, energy, and so on. But I think geopolitically, Iran and Israel, the two countries that can force a wedge between Washington and Beijing strategies for very different reasons. Because Iran is seen by the United States as a geopolitical rival in a vital strategic part of the world, and China and Iran and rather the United States regards Israel as its most dependable regional ally, which feeds into much broader US strategies. and we've seen over 5G and building of this infrastructure in Israel by Chinese companies, the United States is very, very nervous about growing Chinese presence in Israel. And in Iran, of course, so long as this rivalry continues between Washington and Tehran, Washington will continue to see China as the bedrock of Iran's regional role, or at least will perceive it in those terms.
Alex, would you want to add anything?
Yes, sure. First, I totally agree with Degang, Jonathan, and Anush, but I would like to reverse the question. What does the Middle East think about China-US rivalry? And basically, with few exceptions, nobody wants to make a choice. And it's basically Chinese economic power and US strategic and military umbrella. And that's one quite important issue that if both countries know how to work on that, and we already see very good result, for example, in the anti-piracy joint operation where China participated. And then the effect in Gulf of Aden and near the coast of Somalia already showed that this kind of participation was very successful.
So next we'll take a question from Alex Asanov. So let me just unmute you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the insightful discussion today. I want to say my gratitude to you for coming and sharing your knowledge and experience on the topic. My question is with regards, actually the opposite of what the discussion is today, the policy and approach of the Middle East and the Arab countries towards China. So as you know, during the past year and a half, because of the pandemic, there has been a lot of uncertainty in the macro environment. So a lot of dry powder and capital in the world hasn't been deployed. And currently China has many other investments inside it, like building new 5G network base stations or attracting investment for the Sichuan-Tibet Railway or the National Water Network Backbone Project. So my question is with regards to what efforts, if you know, has China taken to attract FDI? Has it been successful? And which sectors are mostly targeted by foreign investors and especially by Middle East investors? And what policy does the Middle East have to China and investment into China itself? Thank you.
Jonathan, since you're in perhaps one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East, could you perhaps take this question?
Yeah, but I don't have any of the money. And I'm not really the Middle East FDI guy. I mean, they've been working with China on a lot of different investment projects. So you can see the UAE and Qatar, for example, both set up a joint investment fund with Chinese entities. And these would be to fund things that are related to either the Belt and Road projects or to vision projects. You know, all of these GCC countries have their vision 2030 or 2040 or whatever. And so those were each jointly funded at 5 billion from each side for a total of 10. Saudi is talking about bringing one in together for 20, but you don't see a lot of stuff, at least I haven't, and maybe Degang maybe could speak more to this, I'm not sure, of actual Middle Eastern FDI going into China. So I'm not sure.
May I follow, yes, Jonathan's remark? First of all, the most urgent thing now is for COVID-19. Therefore, China has donated free of charge a huge number of vaccines to Egypt, to Algeria, Morocco, etc., because that's the very urgent time for China to have partners and friends in the Middle East. China was supported by the Middle Eastern countries in United Nations related to Xinjiang, South China Sea, Tibet, and Hong Kong, Taiwan. Therefore, China would like to have this kind of compensation. And in terms of foreign direct investment, FDI, I think there are the following ways. According to my statistics, the majority of China's investments are in the Gulf countries, plus Egypt and Israel. And in terms of sectors, energy is the predominant one because China is dependent on oil. About 45% of China's imported oil is from the Middle East. about 35% of the imported oil is from the Arab countries. So energy investment, oil, natural gas is very important one. The second one is electricity. China would like to have investment in electricity. If you are traveling in the Middle East, you can find from Egypt to North African countries, people are lack of electricity. So China would like to provide some. And the third one is infrastructures, railways and highways and subways also. Because Chinese have this kind of mentality that is, if you want to be rich, you should build roads first. Therefore, China would like to build subways for Iran, for Turkey, and also highways for other countries. China believes it's very important. Finally, China has built quite successfully industrial parks, both in Egypt and in other countries. Is a great success, including Saudi Arabia. So in the future, China's investment in the Middle East is mostly in infrastructure, railways, seaports, and also subways. Thank you so much.
To add to Degang's observations, Alex, Dorum, for example, in Oman is now set to receive over a period of time as much as $10 billion worth of investments from China, and is going to become a very important infrastructure and hub at that end of the Indian Ocean. And Oman desperately needs that kind of investment. And also the other way, there is quite a lot of joint investments from Saudi and Emiratis in particular into petrochemical plants, downstream energy investments that benefit China, and of course provides further infrastructure for the Gulf states in and around the East Asian markets. So those have been going forward for considerable length of time, and many are now beginning to reach fruition.
Can I add one more sentence following Anusha's remark? That is, in 2020, China has declared over 4 dozen third-party cooperation. It means that, for example, in Lebanon, China and Italy have joint investment in Lebanon. China and Saudi Arabia have joint investment in UAE. These are only the tip of iceberg. So in the future, I think China will lower the risk of investment. It will have the third-party cooperation with the developed economies and developed countries. That will be a very potential area for FDI. Thank you.
And Alex, do you wish to add anything?
Oh yes, just one thing that just using what Degang just mentioned is the fact that when we were mentioning before dual circulation and BRI, already in 2017 and 18, President Xi Jinping called for smarter investment in the BRI. It means at the time that not everywhere, just you put a label BRI, there will be a flow of money without taking into consideration is this money is coming back and is make something that is be useful for the local stakeholder, but also make a financial sense for China. So third-party cooperation, the BRI, and especially in the Middle East, is the way to lower the risk for the investment. And then probably we are going to see an increase of this project when there are several countries that compete. And going to Alex's question, the flow of investment from the Middle East to China, as Anush mentioned correctly, for example, during 2019, when Prince Mohammed bin Salman at his official state visit to China, there was an increase of Aramco and the related investment in the petrochemical sector in China. And this was one of the trends. And of course, the Middle East sovereign wealth found joint investment with the Chinese one in other places of the BRI.
Thank you. And next we'll take a question from Charlie. Let me just unmute you.
Hi, thank you. So this question is very much premised on the fact that China regularly criticizes the West for intervening in other countries on the basis that they're very supportive of the sovereign state and the Westphalian concept, because China views that as a protected notion for itself. Given that the BRI has 120 countries, and that's a very strategic arm for China to pursue, how far does China view each of those 120 countries as sovereign states? And then within that, how far, if opposition were to arise within states against China's projects on the ground, for example, attacking bases or burning 5G wireless poles, would China be prepared to intervene to protect their projects? And if that's the case, how far would China be using force within a sovereign state to do that, given that China criticizes the West for intervening in sovereign states?
Should we begin with Alex on this one, since it's a security-related question?
Okay, first and foremost, if it's the case, when China doesn't invest in weak state, the state can take care of the security issue. It happened, there were several cases spanning not only in the Middle East, but in Central Asia, for example, where the Belt and Road started, that there were environmental problem with the workforce and so on. One of the issues is that with the impact of COVID-19, of course, the BRI also will be affected, and the number of investment probably in some way will decrease. So there are, as I mentioned before in my presentation, a lot of expectation from the Middle East regarding the volume of the Chinese investment, for example, for Syria reconstruction, for Lebanon, but it doesn't necessarily mean that China is going to invest that kind of money. And then if there are local problems, when there are no weak state, is the local government that is only with police force to take care of this. On the other area, when we are witnessing weak government, then, as I mentioned before, Chinese private security is one of the answers. But in guarding infrastructure against political violence, criminal violence, or even act of sabotage, or just very simple theft. And these are the issue. Otherwise, I would not foreseen at all having PLA intervening around for this kind of issue, but that's just my opinion.
Let me add one more sentence. That is, China's foreign policy is non-interference in others' internal affairs. But in Chinese terminology, we have two different terms for 干涉. One is interference, which is negative. One is intervention. And China created a term of creative intervention. It means so long as we have our interests are harmed, and so long as we have UN resolutions and the regional organizations are in support of us, we could have creative intervention for either humanitarian protection or for the protection of China's just interest. It's very vague, but it can be justified in Chinese way. So with the development of with China and expansion of its interest and nationals overseas, Chinese are creative in its terminologies. Therefore, creative intervention led by UN could be a solution to this kind of dilemma. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I said let's try to give Dawn a chance to get back in here if it works now.
Great. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
I'm so very sorry. I don't know what caused that issue. So we will actually we've got a lot of audience questions. My questions were broader, associated with how China is viewed as a great power in the region, especially compared to other great powers, and the ways in which souring US-China relations are impacting China's behavior in the region. I do think that's been covered to a certain extent, but as we get towards the end, if you had anything else to add on that. But I do want to move over back to audience questions. So Dr. Jamal Ladam.
Dr. Ladam, it doesn't seem like you have a microphone connected.
Okay, we will move on to Ibrahim.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for the very interesting session. My question is, how would the Uyghur issue affect China's relation with the Middle East, and will the Middle Eastern country decide to go for money or for, let's say, compatriotism or something of similar? Thank you.
Great. So, Jonathan, do you want to start, or any of the panelists who want to speak on this? And again, the question was regarding Uyghurs more broadly.
Sure, I'll take a crack. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of folks expect that this would be a wedge issue, and it hasn't turned out to be the case at all yet. Given the opportunity to speak out, most Arab countries have actually supported China's position, and I think that's really confounded a lot of people. I don't think it's necessarily purely an economic consideration, as you kind of hinted at, Ibrahim. I think there might be issues of economic concern in there, but I think the bigger issue is China's been pretty successful in framing the Uyghur situation as a response to an extreme political ideology that runs against the state. Now, there have been cases of terrorist attacks in Xinjiang, not many, certainly not enough to justify how it's being handled. But the way Chinese officials have described this frequently is this is our response to political Islam, to separatism, to extremism, to terrorism, these three evils, that the so-called three evils. A lot of countries in the Middle East have the same kind of view of these kind of pressures coming from political ideologies based on religious extremism. So this actually is something that when they see it being framed that way, it's actually something that isn't really seen as much of a problem as you might expect it to be. Another thing, just speaking from somebody who's been in an Arab country for quite a while, is that the Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic people. This is something that in the Middle East right now, there's a lot of competition between Turkey and Saudi, and Turkey and the UAE as leaders of this Sunni group across the Middle East. And Turkey doesn't have a lot of friends in the Middle East right now. Certainly not too many Sunni state friends. So this actually is kind of a political point to say, look, this isn't our problem, this is Erdogan's problem. If anybody should be doing anything, it should be him. So I think I think there's more political issues really than there are economic ones.
Great,
Let me,
thank you.
Yes, can I follow Jonathan's remark? Xinjiang has been demonized, saying that it's unsafe, it's against human rights. I paid a visit to Xinjiang for many times. I noticed that in the past 2 or 3 years, it's safe, it's prosperous, and especially people, no matter if they are Uyghurs or Han or other minorities, say that it's in their interest in the situation now, economically prosperous and politically safe and stable. So I think sometimes Western media has demonized China's policy on Xinjiang. I think it's a great governance. Maybe next time we can invite all of you for a conference in Xinjiang. We can have Xinjiang, yes, we can have Xinjiang food, and also we can have discussion. We can see with our own eyes the profound changes taking place there. Thank you.
And Alex or Anush, do you want to make any comments?
Oh, just following what has been said, looking just from a pure Middle East perspective, if you look at the comment that MBS made during 2019 trip in China, and we are looking from a Kingdom of Saudi Arabia perspective where there is Mecca and Medina, his comment was that China has the right to defend his national security and was basically an issue of counterterrorism policy. Erdogan at the time was more vocal, but in the latest years, and especially now, even the Turkey policy on Uyghur issue has been toned down, while the Chinese security policy, especially in Syria, look at TIP and this kind of terrorist threat and the possible spillover from the Middle East to Afghanistan and from Afghanistan to China.
And Anush, do you have anything you want to add on the topic?
I think they've covered it pretty much. The one thing, of course, is that Western China is not accessible to the rest of the Muslim world, and that distance, not just culture but also geographic and linguistic, means that it's one part of the Muslim community that, frankly, the rest of the Muslim world is unfamiliar with, and is persuaded by one or another. And one of the reasons for their reticence is probably because they simply don't know enough about it. How many Muslim leaders have actually visited that area? I know about 5. That's about it.
Thank you. We'll go to the next question. Jamal.
Thank you so much for giving me this question. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, very good. Thank you. So basically, I've seen like China involving a lot in Middle East. So my question is the following. I saw like China wanted to sustain mutual relations or cooperations with Middle East due to their strategic outcomes. Also, China want to broaden their ties with Arab countries, especially Saudi Arabia, which means it aims to enhance its influence in the region because of the Russian. And also, China wants to keep their situation as normal because of the Russian outcomes in the region. My question is for Mr. Jonathan. Do you think China, as a competitive in the region, jeopardize their Russians' interest in the Middle East? Thank you so much.
Sorry, that's will China jeopardize Russia's interest in the Middle East?
Exactly.
I don't think so. I think Russia and China are playing different games in the Middle East. You know, Russia has had a. When I look at Russia in the Middle East, and I'll be the first to admit that my knowledge of Russia is pretty slim, but what Russia's been doing in the Middle East seems to me to be largely motivated by its own domestic pressures. You know, whether that's its own problems with its Muslim population, or whether that's dealing with economic pressures with oil and gas prices. Russia doesn't seem to have as deep plan for the Middle East as China does. I think I don't see what China's doing is threatening Russia's interests. I think it might actually support it. I mean, what China's doing, and not to be too much of a cheerleader, but with the Belt and Road, some of these projects could be seen as public goods for other countries. You know, if they're investing in ports, if they're investing in pipelines or railroads or whatever, this is something that doesn't just benefit China or the host countries. Other countries who have interests here also will see some of those benefits. So it's not really something that it's not a zero-sum situation, which I think is the big problem we have when we look at the Middle East. Is it doesn't have to be a theater of great power competition. It doesn't have to be a situation where a Chinese gain is a Russian loss or an American loss. So I actually, not to be rude about it, but I would kind of reject the premise of the question, and just I don't see how China's presence here really threatens Russia at all.
Do any other panelists want to make a comment before we move to the next question?
Just a short one. If you want to look at China-Russia competition, then you have to look at Central Asia, essentially. When the narrative is not so simple, like Russia provides security and China provide money. While we are looking at the Middle East, I do think that China totally support the Russian vision for a multipolar equilibrium. Russia has been, military speaking, quite successful in Syria, and in Libya, and is looking at the further expansion via hybrid force, not only with conventional force, but with the use of private military company linking north of Africa with the other part of Russian expansion in Africa. And that don't collide at all with the Chinese expansion. This is an economic expansion. Definitely on that regard, Russia cannot compete at all, cannot even start to think to compete on economical terms with China, whilst vice versa, China on the security one is not going to compete with Russia.
Great. So we will move on to the next question from the audience from Ahmad Omar Ade Hadi.
Yep, that's me. I have a question actually. First of all, thanks very much for Cambridge, Middle East and North African Forum for organizing this, the panel. It's been a very interesting talk. Just a quick question. How do you see China's relations with the Middle East countries after the COVID-19 pandemic? For instance, China's relations with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Thank you.
So Degang, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. Actually, China is now building the so-called the health belt and road in the Middle East. That is, they are jointly supporting vaccination and joint strike against COVID-19. In terms of China's ties with the Gulf countries, you may know that China is the second largest trading partner of the Middle East, next only to European Union. If we divide countries into sovereign states, then China is the largest trading partner of the Middle East. And China is 11 Middle Eastern countries' largest trading partner, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iraq, etc. So China sticks to geoeconomic interests and tries to avoid geopolitical rivalry with both USA and Russia. Just now we talked about Russia. China and Russia have the same ideals, that is, no regime changes by force. However, China and Russia are different. Russians' perception of the Middle East is from the proxy and the geopolitical rivalry with USA. China seeks geoeconomic interest. That is, keep yourself invisible. Try to keep your interest in the geoeconomic domain. Otherwise, China's influence will be curbed by both US and Russia. So in the foreseeable future, China's relations with the Middle Eastern countries are not seriously harmed in the COVID-19 era. Thank you.
Alex would, oh, sorry, Jonathan, please.
So I was just going to say, he mentioned specifically the UAE, and being here, I've been watching it pretty closely. I think, first of all, before COVID, China had a very deep, multi-layered relationship with the UAE. I think the Saudis and Iranians tend to get most of the focus, but if you look at the countries where China's doing the widest range of deals, where it has the biggest population, where its economy, where its trade is most mature, it's the UAE. I've seen data that says across the Mediterranean and the Middle East, France is #1, UAE is #2. So the UAE, I think, is really, I would say, probably the preferred partner for a lot of Chinese companies in the Middle East. You've got something like 6,000 Chinese companies registered in the UAE. There's something like 300,000 Chinese citizens living in this country, which is by far the biggest in the Middle East. They've been cooperating. So this is all pre-COVID stuff. During COVID, there's been a lot of cooperation through BGI and G42 on AI and on COVID treatment and tracing and AI cooperation. So I think what we're seeing is it's actually getting a lot deeper and broader in the UAE. That's spilling over somewhat to the Saudis, but Saudi, I think, is in a lot more pressure in its relationship with the US, which makes it a little less likely to be bold in this situation. But the UAE and China, we've seen it really, really taking off. I would watch that more closely post-COVID.
Anush or Alex?
I'll just one sentence. Ahmad, thank you for the great question. I have to say that beside the Health Silk Road, COVID-19 accelerated process that were already in place. And it means, especially if we look at the Gulf with the rentier economy, they already knew that they have to change their business model in support for the societal development. And COVID-19 accelerated this problem. And on this, China and cooperation, especially on the high-tech sector, is increasing exponentially. So this is one of the trends that, as Jonathan just mentioned, you are going to see from now on an increased investment in all this sector. Like all these countries are going to have a high-tech cooperation, and then they are going to have the same problem, finding the right talent to address this new demand.
Thank you. Naman, I know we're getting very close to the end of our time. Is there time for each panelist just to make a final comment, or how do you want to wrap up?
I agree. I think it's apologies to Jay Ballard, but I think that's probably the best considering the geographic distribution.
Yes.
So yes, let's do that.
Great. So if each panelist, if you have a final comment about what to watch for the future or anything you want to highlight for the audience, and who wants to start? Anush,
Gladly.
I will give you the first opportunity.
Fools rush in. Yeah. I think what to look forward to, and I mean forward rather than look out for, I think is going to be a changing relationship between United States and China. I think the Biden presidency is going to be a signature presidency in that regard. Not the rest of the world are not going to like it very much. All of the world is not going to like it, but I think the measure of diplomacy, as China's UN representatives already noted in the Security Council, is going to bring very different dynamics at the great power level, and that will, I think, percolate downwards into all sorts of discussions, and it may, in fact, even unlock some of the problems the region is facing. But I don't expect China or United States to rush independently or together to bail the region out again. I think the region really does need to sort out its own problems going forward.
Great, thank you. Alex, do you have any final words?
Yes, mostly it's a word of hope, as we just mentioned today several times, that we are going to witness, especially in the Middle East, increase in digitalization. My word of hope is that we are not going to witness, let's say, a split into different sides, a West US-led digital environment and the pure Chinese AI digital environment. And if we are going in this direction, then we are going in the direction of a digital Iron Curtain. And I truly hope that this is not the case.
Great, thank you. And Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I think we've covered all the good stuff. I would just say, as somebody who's watching, 1971 was a monumental year in the PRC's history. And this is also interesting for the Middle East because a lot of countries established diplomatic relations with China. So this year, of course, everybody likes big round numbers. This year is the big 5-0. So you're going to see probably countries like Turkey and Kuwait, even though Kuwait just this week, Yang Jiechi visited, that was a big deal. And Iran, of course, is going to mark the 50th anniversary of those countries establishing diplomatic relations with China. So that's what I keep an eye out. If you're watching China MENA, is just watch those countries, see if there's any kind of big deals or any kind of summits coming up or whatever, because probably we'll see some movement there.
And Degang.
Thank you so much. I think today we have a very good panel, which is titled China in the Middle East, What Next? It means the Middle East is changing. China is changing and US is changing. So our mentality, our research methodology should be changing as well. In other words, in the 21st century, with the changing and changed the situation, we should have something new in our mentality and in our research. And therefore, in the past, we have black and white mentality, but in the future, we can see more and more gray zones. That is, sometimes in the past there are rivalries, but in the future we can have issue linkage. Therefore, in the future, I think as research fellows, we can have a lot of formidable tasks to explore something new in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you. And so thank you to all of you, and thank you to the Cambridge Middle East North Africa Forum. I will hand this over to Nam for final comments.
So first of all, let me thank all 5 of you for joining us today. It was a very fascinating talk. We definitely learned a lot. Also, apologies for any technical error issues on my part. And with that said, I would just like to give everyone a heads up of upcoming events. We haven't announced them yet, but they'll soon be up on our website, Facebook, etc. On the 8th of March, we're set to have an event focused on water and challenges with water resources in the Middle East. And then on the 18th of March, we're having an event on nuclear policy in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and then several more afterwards. We also have a publication called Manara Magazine. It's our flagship publication, a lot of foreign affairs, international geopolitics related analysis. And finally, we have a news update where we do weekly summaries of news of the past week, but also upcoming week and things to keep an eye out for. With that said, let me thank you all again for speaking and for all of you for joining and listening.